The drawer still creaked as I pulled it open, even after my son warned, "Don't touch anything here." As I slid my fingers over the thick envelope inside, I could already feel what he was hiding. While the scent of old paper and varnished wood filled the room, it sharpened every breath I took. The same mother he once trusted to raise him was now the woman he tried to write out quietly. That's when I saw it. The title. Updated. With his name removed. He tried to erase me with silence, so I answered with ink. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The musty smell of old paper filled the quiet study, a room where time seemed to slow to the pace of Marjorie's careful movements. She stood before the worn oak desk, fingers poised over the brass handle of the drawer she had once opened countless times without thought. But now, it felt different. Now this drawer held more than just memories. It held a future she couldn't control. Eric stepped into the doorway, his face tight with impatience. The air felt heavier now, suffused with the tension between them. He took a step forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Mom, don't touch anything here. I'll handle all the estate paperwork. You just need to sign where I tell you." His words stung more than they should have. He'd always been controlling, but this was different. There was an edge to his voice that made her pulse quicken, something subtle but unmistakable. Marjorie's hand dropped to her side, her fingers curling into a fist. She didn't argue, didn't challenge him. Instead, she took a breath, steadying herself, her gaze never leaving the desk as she tried to mask the simmering anger beneath her quiet exterior. Eric's eyes flicked over her, his gaze flickering briefly to the drawer as if to ensure she hadn't moved. "I'll take care of it, Mom," he repeated, though this time the words felt more like an order than an offer. "Just sign the forms when I bring them to you. It'll all be easier that way." She watched him turn away and cross the room to the window, his back to her now, the faintest hint of impatience in his posture as he scanned the view outside. The old wooden desk seemed to hum with the weight of his words, as though the very air around it had thickened. Marjorie hesitated. The drawer beckoned, but it was only when she saw the stack of papers, half covered by a forgotten newspaper, that her breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid the drawer open just enough to peer inside. There, beneath an old photograph of her late husband, were forms, estate forms, pre-filled with Eric's name, blanks where her signature should have been. She let her fingers brush the edges of the paper. There were no mistakes here. He had already filled in the blanks. The dates were set, the properties listed, and there, at the bottom, an ominous empty space where she was supposed to sign. But no, this was not her decision. Not by a long shot. Before she could fully absorb the weight of it, Sharon appeared at the doorway, her smile tight, almost too polished for comfort. "Mom," she said, her tone airy, as if this was all just part of a routine. "You don't need to worry about all these details. You've been through so much. It's really better to leave this to Eric. He's more than capable." Marjorie's chest tightened, the insinuation that she might not be capable enough to understand the paperwork scraping at her pride. But she didn't rise to it. Instead, she nodded, the silence stretching out like a painful wound between them. Eric hadn't turned back around. His attention was still fixed on the window, his posture a little too stiff. It made her wonder what he was really thinking, whether he was aware of how close he was to losing everything he assumed was his. Marjorie forced herself to smile at Sharon. A smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure he is." Her voice was quieter than she intended, but it didn't matter. No one was really listening to her anyway. Anna came into the room then, her soft footsteps almost lost beneath the tension that hung in the air. The teenager didn't say anything at first, just paused in the doorway, her wide eyes catching her grandmother's. Marjorie could see it, the concern in Anna's gaze, the way her lips pressed into a thin line as if she could already sense what was happening. Without a word, Anna crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Marjorie. The hug was brief but warm, her quiet understanding more comforting than any words could have been. "I'll see you later, Grandma," Anna whispered, pulling away. She looked at Eric and Sharon, her expression unreadable, before slipping out of the room. Marjorie stood there for a long moment, the weight of her daughter's unspoken support heavier than any of Eric's attempts to control her. Slowly, she reached for the papers again, feeling their edges like they were alive in her hands, each one a thread in a web she had only just begun to untangle. She closed the drawer with deliberate care, the soft click of the wood echoing louder than it should have. Her eyes lingered on the space where Eric's name had been written, then on the signatures waiting to be signed. Her name, missing. No, she wasn't going to sign. Not like this. But she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that time was running out. And that Eric's words, words he shouldn't have said, had set everything in motion. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, the red folder before her, its contents spilling out like a secret waiting to be uncovered. The photographs were first. Old family pictures, faded snapshots of her late husband's friends, their smiles frozen in time. She printed each one carefully, as though these were the only remnants of a life she could no longer touch. She placed them in the folder, arranging them with an almost reverent attention to detail, one after another, each a step back into the past. Her hands shook as she sifted through the pages. The first few forms she passed over without much thought. They were familiar, routine papers, the kinds of things you'd sign without question. But the last one was different. She recognized it immediately. Her husband's handwriting was there, yes, but only in faint lines. And then, Eric's name. Bold, unyielding, taking up space in the places that should have been hers. The more she read, the more her breath caught in her throat. Each line of the document was a blow. The papers shifted control of the estate to Eric entirely. His name on every dotted line, his authority in every clause. She could feel the rage bubbling inside her, but it was buried beneath the fog of confusion. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. He had planned this. He had been planning it for months, maybe even longer. Her life, her decisions, all sealed in documents she hadn't even been allowed to touch. The weight of it was too much. The room seemed to close in around her, the sound of the clock on the wall ticking louder and louder, until all she could hear was the frantic thumping of her heart. A soft knock on the door broke the silence. "Marjorie?" Lucy's voice was a familiar comfort, always steady, always unshakable. When Marjorie didn't respond right away, the door creaked open and Lucy stepped inside. Her eyes swept over the room with a practiced gaze before landing on the folder in front of Marjorie. Lucy was the kind of woman who noticed everything, and right now, that was a relief. Her sharp eyes zeroed in on the papers, and in an instant, she crossed the room, pulling out the chair opposite Marjorie and sitting down without a word. "What's this?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Marjorie didn't speak at first, her fingers trembling on the edges of the papers. It was hard to find the words, harder still to admit the truth of what she'd discovered. But Lucy's presence was a balm. She reached out, pulling one of the papers toward her. "This is bad, Marjorie," Lucy said quietly after a long pause. "You know this, don't you?" Marjorie swallowed hard, feeling the bile rise in her throat. I think he's already taken everything. I didn't even—" Her voice broke off as the weight of it all crushed down on her. Lucy leaned forward, scanning the document quickly, her frown deepening with every line she read. "He can't do this," she muttered under her breath, the words carrying more venom than Marjorie had ever heard from her. This is illegal. All of it. Marjorie's heart twisted. She wasn't sure what Lucy meant, but the words felt like a lifeline. Still, she felt small, diminished under the intensity of Lucy's scrutiny. I don't understand all of it, she admitted, her voice small. But I know it's wrong. I know it wasn't meant to be this way. Lucy's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Marjorie, you need to see a probate attorney. I'm not just talking about anyone either. Someone who knows how to handle something like this, who can look at these papers and tear them apart. Marjorie didn't speak right away. She'd always trusted Eric, always believed that he had her best interests at heart. But now, seeing the truth in black and white, it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his name on those forms. It was his plan to erase hers. I don't know how to go about this, Marjorie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought he was doing it all for us. For me. But now? Her words trailed off, the weight of betrayal too heavy to put into words. Lucy gave her a steady look, her expression unyielding. It's time to stop trusting him with everything. You need to take control of this, Marjorie, before it's too late. As if on cue, Marjorie's phone buzzed on the table beside her. She reached for it, her heart sinking as she saw Eric's name on the screen. She didn't need to read the message. She already knew it would be one more attempt to control the situation. Sure enough, the message was simple, dismissive. Don't move any paperwork. I'll handle it this weekend. She felt her pulse quicken. His words weren't just controlling. They were a warning. He was tightening the grip on the life she had once shared with her husband, and she hadn't even realized it was happening. Lucy stood up, her movements deliberate and sharp. You don't have time to wait for him, Marjorie. You have to act now. Trust me on this. Marjorie looked down at the papers again, then back at Lucy. The truth was clear now. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. The door closed behind Lucy and Marjorie was alone again, the silence in the room suddenly unbearable. Her fingers hovered over the phone. One message, one call to an attorney. It would be the first step in taking her life back. But as she picked up the phone, she felt something deep in her gut, a nagging feeling that the road ahead would be much more difficult than she had ever anticipated. And yet, it was a road she had to walk. Her finger hovered over the dial, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like 1,000 bricks. Marjorie sat in the waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the folder of papers clenched between her fingers like a lifeline. The soft hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. The attorney's office felt sterile, impersonal, a far cry from the familiar warmth of her home, the one place she had once felt in control. Now, she was here, surrounded by strangers, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would need an attorney to understand the documents Eric had so carelessly handed her. The very idea felt like a betrayal. Yet, here she was. The door to the office opened and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was calm, composed, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "You must be Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice low and even. "Yes," Marjorie replied, rising to meet him, clutching the red folder like it was the last thing tethering her to sanity. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Please, have a seat." Marjorie sat, her movements deliberate. She placed the folder on the table between them, its contents now a mountain of dread and uncertainty. Stephen Avery sat down across from her, his demeanor cool but not unkind. His eyes flicked to the papers she had laid out, and he immediately picked them up, his fingers brushing the edges as he began scanning through them. Marjorie watched him closely, noticing how his face tightened with each page he flipped. "I see," he said quietly, pausing for a moment. "This is bad, Mrs. Hale. Very bad. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them. Calm, matter of fact, as if he had seen this kind of manipulation before. He continued reading, the sound of paper rustling in the otherwise silent room, the only sound for several long minutes. Then, Stephen placed the documents back on the table, his expression unreadable, though the intensity of his gaze suggested he was sizing her up in a way that made her feel exposed. "How long has your son been managing things for you?" he asked, leaning back slightly in his chair. Marjorie swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had trusted Eric, trusted him as any mother would trust her child. But now that trust felt like an illusion, a threadbare cloak that no longer shielded her. He's been taking care of things for a while now," she said, her voice faltering. "Ever since my husband passed, he said it would be easier this way, that I didn't need to worry about the details." Stephen didn't say anything immediately, he simply nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of skepticism and professional understanding, that made her feel small. "I'm sorry to say this," he said after a moment, "but your son has manipulated these documents in ways that could leave you vulnerable. Not just financially, but legally. This isn't just a case of oversight or poor judgment. This is coercion." The word hit her like a slap. Marjorie's hands clenched around the edges of the folder as if by holding onto it tighter, she could hold on to something stable, something that wasn't being taken from her. "I don't," she started, her voice shaking. "But Eric, he's my son. He wouldn't do that to me." Stephen's gaze softened, but only slightly. "He's your son, yes. But you have to understand something. People change, especially when money is involved. And it looks like your son has seen an opportunity here to take control of your estate without your consent." Marjorie's stomach twisted as the full weight of his words sank in. "So, what do I do? What happens now?" Stephen took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers as he laid out her options. "The good news is, you have rights. As his mother and the surviving spouse, you are entitled to a portion of the estate. But these documents," he gestured to the papers, "they're not just flawed. They're illegal. Your signature was coerced, if not outright forged. We can challenge this." A flicker of hope sparked within her, but it was quickly smothered by the overwhelming realization of what would be required. "How long will this take?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It won't be quick. The process will take time, probably months. There will be hearings, filings, and I won't lie to you. It will be an uphill battle. But if we act now, we have a good chance of not only protecting your rights, but also regaining control over your assets." Marjorie's heart pounded in her chest. Months of waiting. Months of fighting. Could she do it? Could she take on Eric and Sharon, knowing how deeply they had already intertwined their lives with the idea of control? Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table in front of her. She glanced down, her breath catching in her throat. Another message from Eric. "Just stay out of it, Mom. I'll handle everything this weekend. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Stephen's eyes moved to her phone, and then back to her face, reading her expression like an open book. "He's trying to control the narrative," he said quietly, his voice firm. "Don't let him." Marjorie felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just about her home or her estate. It was about taking back something much more precious, her autonomy, her voice. For the first time in years, she realized she had been giving away her power, piece by piece, and Eric had been the one collecting it. "I'll help you," Stephen continued, "but you have to be ready for this fight. It will be messy. It will be painful. But if you're ready to reclaim what's yours, we can do it." Marjorie's finger hovered over the screen of her phone, staring at Eric's message. The decision hung in the air like a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. She was alone in this fight now. And yet, the path ahead was clearer than it had ever been. "Let's do it," she whispered, almost to herself. Stephen nodded, his face resolute. "Good. It's time to take back what's yours." As Marjorie stood up, the weight of the decision settling over her, she felt the first real flicker of resolve in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for her estate, she was fighting for herself. The house was quieter than usual, the stillness wrapping around Marjorie like an old coat she'd forgotten to shed. She sat at the kitchen table, the binder open before her, its red cover stark against the pale wood. In her careful, deliberate handwriting, she had labeled it, "My Decisions." The title felt like a declaration, a promise to herself that from now on, she would be the one in control. With Stephen's help, she had drafted the first of many legal documents, the will, the trust, the property titles. She flipped through each page slowly, rereading the clauses as if she could somehow absorb them into her skin. Each decision was more than just ink on paper. It was a fortress, built piece by piece, that would protect her from the life she had once believed was secure. She traced her fingers along the edges of the will. The words that had been so foreign to her just days ago now felt like a shield. Eric's name had no place here, not as the executor, not as the sole beneficiary. Instead, she had carefully allocated the assets to where they truly belonged, to Anna, the granddaughter who had always made her heart feel light. Stephen's words echoed in her mind as she read over the trust. "If you want to protect yourself, you have to be precise, Marjorie. Every detail matters." The legal terms were foreign, but with Stephen's guidance, she understood that she had the power to rewrite her future. And that power, once so easily surrendered, was now hers to reclaim. But there was more to do. Marjorie picked up her phone and dialed her bank's number, her voice steady, but her heart racing. She'd reviewed her financial accounts last night, every balance, every statement, and had a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had always trusted Eric to manage things. Hadn't he said he was doing it for her benefit? But the truth was harder to ignore now. There was no transparency, no clarity, nothing left to chance. As the call connected, Marjorie kept her focus. Her fingers flipped through pages of financial statements, reading off account numbers as she made sure everything was in order. The line on the other end of the phone was warm but distant, and when the conversation ended, Marjorie felt a sense of unease hanging in the air. She had been too trusting, too passive, but not anymore. The phone buzzed in her hand, a sharp interruption to the quiet morning. Marjorie's heart skipped when she saw Eric's name. "Mom, have you touched anything? I told you to leave the paperwork alone." His voice crackled from the other end. There was no warmth in it, just a tightness, as if he were trying to reel her back in. She set the phone on the counter, her hands trembling only slightly as she let the words sink in. "I told you to leave the paperwork alone." It was a reminder of how he had been handling everything for her, how he'd kept her at arm's length, how he thought he could simply take over. She knew he wouldn't understand. He never had. But this was different. "Mom?" Eric's voice was more urgent this time, as if he could somehow hear her thoughts, as if he were trying to reach through the phone and pull her back into his world. Marjorie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she set the phone down and picked up another stack of papers from the corner of the table. Lucy had stopped by earlier that morning, helping her gather birth certificates, marriage records, and deeds. The pile of documents seemed endless, but it was the history of her life, her husband's life, her own, preserved in these brittle sheets of paper. Lucy had insisted that everything needed to be accounted for. If Marjorie was going to reclaim control, she would have to prove her ownership, her rights. And so, she organized the papers carefully, placing them in separate folders with clear labels: house deeds, marriage certificate, insurance policies. She even made a note for herself. Anna, my medical contact. She'd always trusted Eric with that role, but now, the idea of him making decisions about her health felt like a betrayal. The phone buzzed again, more impatient this time. Marjorie could almost feel the pressure building on the other end. He was waiting for her to bend. She stood up slowly, her fingers running over the edges of the files. There was no turning back now. She had made her decisions, and nothing, no amount of pressure or guilt from Eric would change that. When she picked up the phone again, her voice was firm. Eric, I've made my decisions. I'm not asking for your approval anymore. There was silence on the other end, the kind that made her stomach twist. She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind as he processed her words. But instead of anger, there was a strange calmness that settled over her. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. I'll handle it myself, Mom, he finally muttered, the words thick with frustration. I'm sure you will, she replied, and hung up before he could say anything more. As she turned back to her binder, her fingers brushing the corners of each document, she felt a small but unmistakable shift in the air around her. She was no longer the passive observer of her own life. She was the one driving the narrative now. She wasn't just rewriting her will, she was rewriting her entire future. But as she closed the binder, a sinking feeling lodged in her chest. Eric had no idea what she was capable of, what she had already set into motion, and that, more than anything else, made her feel a strange, dark thrill, because she knew, now, that her next move would be one he could never anticipate. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The walls of Marjorie's kitchen felt smaller now, the weight of the binder before her pushing against her chest. She hadn't realized how heavy it would feel, how loaded each page had become with the decisions she had made. It was still so new, this power she had reclaimed. She could almost feel it hum in the air around her, as if the very space of the house was starting to shift with her new resolve. She ran her fingers over the edges of the legal documents she'd signed just hours before. The ink was still fresh, but the air seemed to crackle with a tension she couldn't shake. The feeling of betrayal had faded, but the quiet anger, toward Eric, toward herself for waiting so long, remained. Just then, her phone buzzed. The screen flashed with Stephen's name. Her pulse quickened, and she immediately picked up, her breath holding for a moment before she answered. Stephen, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I've been looking over the estate records. Stephen's calm voice came through, like a steady current cutting through the fog. I've got some news. Something you need to hear. Her stomach flipped. What is it? There was a brief pause before he continued. Eric tried to file preliminary estate control papers. His name was on them as executor. He submitted them to the court last week. A cold shiver ran down Marjorie's spine. What? She gasped, her grip tightening on the phone. How? What happened? They were rejected, Stephen said, his voice flat but firm. Because of missing signatures. Specifically, your signature. Marjorie's heart raced. The world seemed to blur for a moment. Missing signatures. The realization slammed into her. Eric had been so sure, so confident that he could pull everything under his control. She had almost lost it all. So close. For a long moment she could only breathe, the silence between them growing thick with the weight of what this meant. She had felt it. Felt how Eric had been tightening his hold around her life. But now, this was the truth. He had already tried to take it without her even knowing. Close. Stephen's voice cut through the fog, but not close enough. The court won't accept those papers. They're void. Marjorie let out a slow breath. She'd nearly been a victim of her own trust, her own naivety. And yet, the thought that Eric's plans had been halted by something as simple as a missing signature felt like a cruel irony. "You're in the clear," Stephen said, his voice a little softer now, almost as if trying to offer her some peace. "But we're not finished. Not yet." Marjorie swallowed, trying to collect herself. "What do we do next?" "I'm drafting an irrevocable trust for you," Stephen continued, the resolve in his voice sharpening once more. "It will protect everything, your home, your assets. Everything will be locked down. Eric won't be able to touch a single thing." Marjorie didn't answer right away. The magnitude of Stephen's words, locked down, irrevocable, settled into her like a weight lifting. It was a sense of finality, a promise that she would never be vulnerable to Eric's machinations again. "Thank you, Stephen," she said, her voice steady now, more certain than it had been in days. "When can I sign it?" "Tonight. I'll bring the final documents to you." He paused before adding, "You'll need witnesses, of course." "I'll have Lucy help," Marjorie replied, her eyes glancing toward the door as she said it. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning her next steps, but a part of her, a quiet part, still uncertain, was glad that Lucy would be there. The familiar comfort of someone she trusted by her side felt like a silent reassurance. "Good," Stephen said. "I'll see you soon." As she hung up the phone, Marjorie felt the sense of certainty wash over her. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was erasing Eric's future from her own. A quiet satisfaction hummed through her veins as she stood up, the binder now feeling lighter in her hands. This was real. She was taking control. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. Marjorie walked toward the door, each step purposeful. She opened it to find Stephen standing with a leather portfolio in hand. Behind him, Lucy stepped forward, her expression unreadable but steady. "Let's get this done," Stephen said, offering her a small, knowing smile. He looked at Lucy. "You're the witness?" Lucy nodded. "I'm ready." They moved into the kitchen, where the binders still lay open on the table, the papers ready for their final signatures. Marjorie sat down, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, but she held herself steady. The trust was now irrevocable. No more changes, no more room for Eric to manipulate. This was it. She picked up the pen. As she signed, the realization of what she had done, the steps she had taken to finally remove Eric from everything, felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. She was free. She was in control. And for the first time in years, the air felt lighter. But as she signed the final document, the phone buzzed once more. Her hand hesitated over the paper. The message on the screen flashed. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Now." Eric. Marjorie's heart raced again. Her hand shook as she set the pen down. But this time, she didn't pick up the phone. Instead, she looked at Lucy and Stephen. She was done with his demands. This time, she was no longer going to let him control the narrative. She had already taken back her life, and now, she was ready to live it. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Marjorie's shoes as she stood before the heavy doors, her hands still gripping the leather portfolio that held the irrevocable trust and the newly updated will. It was an odd feeling, almost as if she were walking into an entirely new chapter of her life, one she'd never quite envisioned for herself, yet one that now felt like it belonged to her. Stephen stood beside her, a quiet presence of professionalism and calm, his eyes scanning the building before settling back on her. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low but sure. Marjorie nodded. The weight of everything, of every decision, every signature, hung heavily in the air. Her pulse still quickened at the thought of what she had just done, but there was no turning back now. With a final glance at the doors, she took a deep breath and pushed them open. The courthouse was a cavernous space, all marble and echoing silence, broken only by the hushed voices of people milling about. The clerk at the desk greeted them with a polite smile, but it was the documents in Marjorie's hands that carried the real weight. As she slid the trust and will across the counter, The clerk flipped through the pages quickly, checking each detail before looking up at her. "You're certain this is everything?" he asked, his tone professional but with a hint of curiosity. Marjorie nodded again, her voice steady despite the quick beat of her heart. "Yes, that's everything." The clerk didn't question her further, simply stamping the documents with a finality that sent a sharp thrill through her. As if with that single motion, the power had been reset. Eric's name was nowhere in sight. Her name, her decisions, were the ones that mattered now. Stephen smiled faintly, his eyes meeting hers as they stepped away from the counter. "It's done." Marjorie stood there for a moment, just breathing in the space around her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel weighed down by the world. The binders, the signatures, the constant feeling of being sidelined in her own life, those things no longer had a hold on her. Later, over coffee in a small corner cafe, Lucy raised her mug with a grin. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes sparkling with unspoken pride. Marjorie couldn't help but smile back, the warmth of the moment sinking into her like a balm. For so long she had let herself be overlooked, let Eric take the reins without question. But now, she had control, not just of her estate, but of her life. "I didn't think I could do it," Marjorie confessed, her voice softer now, a new vulnerability creeping in. "All this time, I just let it happen. I let him push me aside." Lucy's smile softened as she leaned forward. "You've always had the strength, Marjorie. You just needed to see it." Marjorie took a long sip of her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. The weight of the past few weeks, the fear, the uncertainty, was lifting. A new confidence was taking its place, settling into her bones like it had always been there, waiting to emerge. But as she set her mug down, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw Eric's name flashing across it. "Have you touched any of my paperwork? Where is it? I need to talk to you. Now." The words felt like a demand, an order. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. The anger she had tried to keep at bay surged to the surface. He was still trying to pull her back, still trying to control the situation. But there was something different now. Marjorie wasn't just a passive participant in his plans. She wasn't going to let him dictate the terms anymore. Her thumb hovered over the phone for a beat before she replied. "I've been busy." It wasn't a lie. She had been busy. Busy taking back her life. Busy making decisions that would no longer revolve around him. She placed the phone face down on the table, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Lucy raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She understood. There was no need to explain anymore. Marjorie was no longer the woman who let others take charge. She was in control now. The next message came just moments later, this time from Sharon. Marjorie glanced at it, her lips pressing together as she read the words. "This is tearing the family apart, Marjorie. I thought you cared about family unity. Why are you doing this? You're making a huge mistake." The words felt like they were meant to twist her insides, to play on the guilt that had always hung over her head like a shadow. But there was nothing to feel guilty about anymore. She had made the right choice. She had made her decisions. She didn't respond. "Family unity?" Marjorie murmured under her breath, shaking her head. "I've been doing this for the family, for Anna, for myself." Lucy gave her a wry smile. "You don't need to explain it to me, but Eric and Sharon, they won't understand that." Marjorie sat back in her chair, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She had been the one to hold everything together for so long. She had been the one to make the sacrifices. But now, it was her time to live. She picked up her phone once more, quickly turning off the screen before it could buzz with another message from Eric or Sharon. It was done. She wasn't just living for them anymore. She was living for herself. And that was something they would never understand. The kitchen table was cluttered now, not with the documents of old promises, but with new declarations, new rights, new responsibilities. Marjorie sat across from Stephen, the deed to her home in front of her, a paper so familiar, yet now more powerful than it had ever been. It was no longer just a house. It was hers, completely and entirely. "Here it is," Stephen said, tapping the deed with the edge of his pen, his voice steady, a contrast to the butterflies in Marjorie's stomach. "It's all official now. Your home, your property, everything is secured in your name. The title's been updated." Marjorie ran her fingers over the paper, the heavy ink of her name now stamped firmly as the sole owner. For years, she had lived in a space where her ownership was always more implied than recognized. Eric's name had loomed in the background, waiting like a shadow, and now he was gone from this equation. Her gaze flicked to the corner of the document where she had named Anna as the future beneficiary. Her heart swelled with pride. Anna, her granddaughter, would be the one to take this place into the future. The girl had always brought light to these old walls, and now it seemed fitting. The house, like her legacy, would be handed down, but this time, on her terms. Stephen leaned back, his fingers tapping the edge of his coffee cup. "We've done what we needed to. This is your protection, Marjorie. No one can change this now. Not Eric. Not anyone." Marjorie didn't speak for a moment. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, of how close she had come to losing everything, of how long she had lived in the shadows of others' expectations. But this now was hers. She wasn't just a bystander in her own life anymore. She was living it. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. The screen lit up with a name she had been expecting. Eric. She glanced at Stephen. He gave her a knowing look, but said nothing. She picked up the phone, her fingers briefly trembling as she read the message. "Where are the papers? I need to see them. Now." The demand was harsh, and Marjorie could almost hear his voice through the cold words, that familiar edge of control and entitlement. A quiet sigh escaped her lips. She put the phone down without responding. Eric wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to not having a hand in every decision. But that was the point. He had never had the right to control this home, not in the way he thought he did. A sudden knock at the door startled her. She exchanged a look with Stephen before walking toward the sound. Her pulse quickened for a moment, but she steadied herself. This was her moment, after all. She opened the door, and there he was. Eric stood on the doorstep. His face twisted with frustration and a hint of panic. His hands were thrust into his pockets, his stance rigid, as though he were preparing for a confrontation. "Mom," he said sharply, his voice brittle with barely controlled anger. "Where are the desk papers? I need to see them. Right now." Marjorie took a breath, her posture straightening. "Eric," she began calmly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that had once ruled her. "I've reorganized my files. They're in order now." He blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "What do you mean, reorganized? Those papers are mine. I need to see them, now." Marjorie held her ground. "I've made sure everything is in order," she said, her tone measured, controlled. "You don't need to worry about them anymore." The words hung in the air for a moment, thick with unspoken tension. Eric's eyes flickered to the side, as if searching for any hint of weakness in her. His hands were clenched now, the fingers twitching as if he were about to reach for the door, to barge in and demand access. But he held himself back, eyes narrowing. "This isn't over, Mom," he muttered, his voice low but cold. "You don't get to just shut me out." Marjorie didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands now folded neatly in front of her. She had seen the panic creeping into his eyes, the realization that his control was slipping. This was more than just a demand for papers. It was the last vestige of his hold over her life, and now it was crumbling. "No, Eric," she said, her voice firm. "It's over. Everything is under control." The words seemed to settle between them like a final verdict. Eric opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His frustration was palpable, but there was nothing he could do now. He couldn't undo the steps she had taken. He couldn't erase the decisions she had made. He turned sharply, pacing away, his back stiff with anger, before pausing at the edge of the driveway. For a long moment he stood there, as if deciding whether to say something else. But then, without a word, he got into his car and drove away. Marjorie stood on the porch, watching him go, the air around her feeling still, almost expectant. Stephen appeared beside her, a small but approving smile on his face. "You handled that well," he said quietly, his gaze lingering on her. Marjorie looked back toward the road, watching the taillights fade into the distance. A quiet satisfaction bloomed inside her, but it wasn't just because Eric had left. It was because she had finally taken control. This house, this life, it was hers now, not his. And no matter what he said or did, he couldn't change that. She turned back to Stephen, a small, contented smile on her lips. "It's really over now." And for the first time in a long while, it felt like she could finally breathe. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her coffee cup, the warmth seeping into her palms as though it might calm the storm brewing inside her. The phone had been silent for almost an hour, but now it buzzed again. This time with an urgency she couldn't ignore. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening as Eric's name flashed in bold letters. She had barely managed to exhale when the phone rang. "Mom." Eric's voice shattered the calm, his tone frantic. Far different from the smug confidence he'd always worn like a second skin. "What did you do with my papers? Where are they? I need to see them. Now." The words hit her like a slap. She hadn't expected him to show up at her door, but the phone call was something else entirely, a desperate demand for control that he could no longer hold. Marjorie set the phone on speaker, her eyes narrowing as she forced herself to stay composed. She'd been expecting this. Eric wasn't the type to back down, not when something slipped from his grip. But it didn't matter anymore. Her hand rested on the papers in front of her, the documents that had freed her, the documents that Eric had no claim to. "They were never your papers, Eric," Marjorie said, her voice unwavering, slicing through his panic. "They never had your name on them legally." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, the only sound was Eric's shallow breaths. Then, the words came, harsh and tight, as though he could hardly contain the fear building inside him. "I need to know what you signed," he demanded. "What did you sign, Mom? Where's the will? The trust?" The panic was thick in his voice now, and Marjorie could feel the waves of it trying to push through the line, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could finally cut the strings that bound her to his control. She sat up straighter, her spine like steel. "Speak with my attorney," she said calmly. "Everything has been handled legally. If you want to know, you'll have to ask Stephen." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Marjorie could feel his frustration building, his inability to comprehend what had just happened, the fact that she had made her own choices, that she had taken control of her life. "You don't get to make decisions like this." Eric's voice rose, the panic giving way to rage. "You can't just shut me out like this. I'm your son. You're supposed to trust me." Marjorie's hand clenched around the phone, but she kept her voice steady. "I did trust you, Eric. But you didn't respect me. You didn't respect my decisions. I'm not asking for your approval anymore." The words hung in the air between them like an unspoken truth. Eric didn't respond immediately. She could hear the anger still vibrating in his chest, But he didn't have the power to lash out in the same way he had in the past. This time, she wasn't afraid. The phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Sharon. Marjorie glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening as she read the words. "This is tearing the family apart, Marjorie. We need to talk. This isn't you. You've crossed a line." Marjorie's hand shook, but she steadied it before responding. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she weighed her options. She had no intention of explaining herself to Sharon. There was no need. This wasn't about family unity anymore. This was about her safety, about her future. Instead, she put the phone down without responding. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Marjorie walked to the front door, her heart still racing from the phone call. She opened it to find Eric standing on the other side, his face pale with anger. His fists were clenched at his sides, and his chest heaved with the effort of trying to stay composed. "Mom," he spat, his voice shaking with frustration. "What the hell did you do?" Marjorie took a step back, her eyes locking with his. He was used to imposing himself, to pushing his way through every decision, but she wasn't the same woman she had been before. She didn't flinch this time. She didn't step aside. "I've taken care of things," she said firmly, her voice cool but with a new, undeniable strength. "You don't need to worry about anything anymore. Everything is under control." Eric stared at her, the panic still flickering in his eyes, but it was laced with something else now, something that felt more like defeat than anger. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and guttural. "I'll find a way to fix this." But Marjorie didn't respond. She stood there. The door half open, the space between them filled with the weight of what had already happened. Eric had underestimated her. He had assumed he could bully her into silence, into submission. But now, the tables had turned. "You don't have the power to fix anything anymore," she said, her voice final. "And you're not going to get it back." For a moment the words seemed to settle over him, and he stood there motionless. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed off down the porch. His anger still radiating from him, but it was hollow. He had lost. Marjorie stood in the doorway watching him leave. As the car disappeared down the street, a wave of calm washed over her. It was over. The control he once held over her was gone, and this time, there would be no going back. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers before her, the cool, familiar weight of them now almost comforting. The final beneficiary details were simple. Anna, her granddaughter, the one person in this house who still felt like home, the one person whose presence had always reminded her that, despite the chaos, there was still something worth fighting for. She had already updated her will, every detail meticulously redrawn, and now, the final act was almost complete. A part of her wondered if she should feel more triumphant, but the quiet relief settled in instead. This was more about reclaiming peace than revenge. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Stephen. Always reliable. Always calm. "Come in," Marjorie said, her voice calm, though there was a subtle thrill in the air. A sense of closure coming into focus. Stephen entered carrying a folder of documents, his expression steady as ever. He placed the folder in front of her, leaning back against the counter with a slight, knowing smile. "I've got some updates," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, but with a hint of something darker underneath. Marjorie raised an eyebrow, leaning forward, her heart quickening slightly. "Go on?" "Eric filed a petition to contest the estate," he said, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather. "But it was rejected. Court didn't even look twice." Marjorie's breath caught, the news landing heavier than she expected. She'd known he wouldn't take this lying down, but the sheer audacity of it, of him trying to undo what she'd put in motion, caught her off guard. The petition was denied? She asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Stephen nodded, flipping open the folder to show her the court's decision. Completely. They cited insufficient grounds. He was trying to claim your mental incapacity, among other things. But everything was in order. And your trust is irrevocable, Marjorie finished for him, her lips curling slightly into a smile she couldn't fully suppress. It's a real blow to his plans, Stephen added, the faintest trace of something almost resembling admiration in his voice. He thought he could wiggle his way around it. But this, he said, tapping the document, this seals it. For a moment, Marjorie sat there in stunned silence, the weight of it sinking in. Eric had tried to manipulate the legal system, tried to undermine everything she had worked for, but it hadn't worked. It couldn't work. This wasn't just some fleeting legal trick. It was a failure, and one that would send ripples through his carefully constructed world. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. So that's it? He's done? Stephen smiled, a small, knowing thing. It's over. His petition was denied. And with the irrevocable trust in place, there's no going back. Marjorie looked down at the papers again, a rush of vindication coursing through her veins. She had won. She wasn't just protecting her assets anymore. She was safeguarding her dignity. The control Eric once had was slipping further away. But the storm was far from over. As if on cue, the phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sharon. Marjorie hesitated before picking it up. Sharon's words flashed across the screen, a mixture of panic and guilt. Marjorie, this is all falling apart. I can't believe you're doing this. We need to come together as a family, please. Think about what this is doing to us. Marjorie stared at the message, her lips pressed tightly together. Sharon always knew how to twist the knife with guilt, how to make it sound like she was the one being unreasonable. But this time, it didn't work. Not anymore. She set the phone down, the message left unread. She didn't owe Sharon an explanation. She didn't owe Eric an explanation. This was her life. Her decisions. Stephen's voice brought her back to the present. Sharon's panicking, he said, his tone sympathetic but neutral. She knows the financial foundation they've built is crumbling. Marjorie nodded, but a small part of her couldn't suppress the flicker of something darkly satisfying. They had always counted on her to be the easy target, the one who wouldn't fight back. But now they were realizing just how wrong they had been. Anna's footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Marjorie turned to find her granddaughter standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, searching. Anna had been quieter in recent weeks, as if she had been sensing the shift in the house. The walls that had once felt oppressive to Marjorie now seemed filled with a new kind of energy, a freedom Anna had always wanted to be a part of. "You're making the right choices," Anna said quietly, her voice steady with unspoken understanding. "I can see it, Grandma. You're taking back everything." Marjorie smiled, the corners of her lips lifting. The bond between them had always been a quiet strength, a reminder that, despite everything, she hadn't been completely alone. "Yes," Marjorie said softly, reaching for the papers again. "Everything is under control." And with that, she finalized the last of the documents with Stephen's help. The final pieces of her future, the future she was taking back, now set in stone. But as she signed her name once more, something caught her attention, a soft buzzing from her phone. A final message from Eric. She picked it up, the screen lighting up with the words, "I will make you regret this." Her fingers tightened around the phone. Eric was still clinging to the illusion that he had any control over her. But as she set the phone down, her eyes met Stephen's, and she knew this was the last threat. It would be the last of his empty promises. She had already taken back everything, and now, nothing could stop her. The doorbell rang with a sharpness that made the air in Marjorie's kitchen feel suddenly too thin. She glanced at the clock, just past noon, and felt the heavy weight of inevitability settle in. She'd been waiting for this moment, and now it had arrived. Eric wasn't done yet. Marjorie stood from the table, the papers she'd signed only hours ago still lying there, each one a promise she had made to herself. A promise that no one would take away from her again. As she moved to the door, her hand rested on the edge of the table, feeling the comforting presence of everything she had fought for. She opened it before the second ring. Eric stood there, rigid, his face a mask of fury. His eyes were wide with something that hovered just beyond rage, something more dangerous. Desperation. "Mom!" he spat, stepping forward without waiting for an invitation. "What the hell have you done? I need you to reverse this trust. Now." His voice was trembling with barely contained fury, and he stepped into the doorway as though he thought his presence alone could demand compliance. Marjorie stood her ground. She didn't flinch, didn't take a step back. This time, she was the one holding the ground. "Eric, I'm not reversing anything." Her voice was calm, firm. "You don't get to control me anymore. It's done." His face twisted with disbelief, like a child whose toy had been taken from him. "You're making a huge mistake. You can't just shut me out like this. It's my inheritance too." He stepped closer, his eyes wild, voice rising. "You're being unreasonable. You have to give me a chance." "Eric," she said, cutting him off, her voice still steady. "Those papers never had your name legally. You have no claim here." The words were a balm to her own soul, and they stung him like a slap. For a second he just stood there, his mouth open, as if waiting for her to take it all back. But Marjorie stood silent, her chin held high. She wasn't budging. The phone buzzed in her pocket. She knew it was Stephen without even checking, but she let it go to voicemail. She didn't need to hear his voice right now. She needed to make this clear. For herself. For Eric. For everyone. Eric, seeing her unwavering resolve, shifted tactics. His voice softened, but there was nothing sincere in it. "Mom, you're not thinking straight. This is tearing the family apart." His tone turned pleading, like an actor reading from a script meant to manipulate. "Sharon and we've always been there for you. You can't just throw that away. You're destroying everything." Marjorie's jaw tightened, her hand gripping the door handle until her knuckles turned white. "I'm protecting myself, Eric. For the first time in years, I'm doing what's right for me. Not you, not Sharon, not anyone else. Just me." He recoiled, as though her words physically hit him. There was a long, charged silence between them, heavy with everything left unsaid, with the expectations he could no longer fulfill. "You don't understand," Eric muttered almost to himself. "You can't just make these decisions on your own. You need us. You need family." Marjorie felt the bite of his words, but she didn't let them in. She wasn't playing by his rules anymore. She could almost hear Sharon's voice in his, a tactic she'd used many times over the years. But it was hollow now, empty. She was done feeling guilty for taking control of her own life. "Go back to Sharon, Eric," she said, her voice now colder than she thought it would be. "I'm not going to change my mind." She took a step back, closing the door halfway, but he shoved his hand against it, forcing it open again. "Mom, don't do this. You're going to regret it. You'll see." The doorbell rang again, and this time it was not the sound of Eric's frustration, but of Lucy's familiar, comforting presence. Marjorie glanced over her shoulder and saw her friend standing in the driveway, a calm look in her eyes. Eric saw Lucy and his fury seemed to double. He made a sharp movement, trying to force the door open even further. "She's not even supposed to be here," he hissed. "Eric, please leave," Marjorie said, her voice a low, controlled command, just as Stephen's voice crackled through her phone. "I don't need to speak to you anymore. I've made my decision. Eric turned and stormed off the porch without another word, his shoulders tight with frustration. The last vestiges of his power over her were gone, lost in the cloud of his own anger. Lucy stepped inside, a knowing look in her eyes as she surveyed the scene. How'd it go? Perfectly, Marjorie said with a small smile, her voice tinged with quiet satisfaction. I've made the final call. She turned to Lucy, her heart lighter than it had been in years. It's over. The house is mine. Everything is mine, and nothing will change that. Good, Lucy replied, her smile warm as she closed the door behind her. Now, let's get this place the upgrades it deserves. Marjorie nodded, her eyes flickering toward the empty space in front of her. The house, her home, would be a place of peace again, where no one could ever again take what was hers. And in that moment, she knew she had taken back everything. The doorbell rang again, and this time, Marjorie didn't even need to glance at the clock. She knew who it was. The buzz of anxiety that had been creeping up her spine since the morning solidified into a sharp knot in her stomach. Eric and Sharon. They had come for answers, come to drag her back into their world of control. She stood for a moment, taking a deep breath, before walking toward the door. The wooden frame of the house, the familiar scent of old wood and coffee that filled the air, all of it felt more like a sanctuary now. This was her space, her home, and no one would take it from her. When she opened the door, Eric and Sharon were standing there, side by side, their faces etched with frustration and something deeper: betrayal. Sharon's eyes were narrow, her lips pulled into a tight line that Marjorie knew well. She'd seen it before. The face of someone who was about to try to guilt her into submission. Mom, Eric started, his voice sharp. This is ridiculous. We need to talk. You've gone too far. Marjorie didn't flinch. She stepped aside, silently motioning for them to enter. Come in, she said calmly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. We'll talk. They crossed the threshold, Sharon's high heels clicking on the wooden floor, each step a reminder of how deeply embedded they were in the house she had once called theirs. But that was over. Marjorie led them to the living room and sat down on the old armchair by the window, her eyes never leaving their faces. She watched as Eric stood tall, his fists clenched, and Sharon perched on the edge of the couch, her posture too controlled, too rigid. They were on the attack, but she had prepared herself. Sit down, Marjorie said softly, her voice firm but not unkind. Eric hesitated, but after a brief look from Sharon, he sank into the armchair opposite her. Sharon, however, remained standing, as if the air itself was too thick for her. Marjorie, Sharon began, her voice colder than usual, we need to understand what you've done. You've gone behind our backs, completely disregarded everything we've worked for, and now, this. Her eyes flicked to the papers on the coffee table. This is betrayal. You're tearing the family apart. Marjorie held her ground, her posture unwavering. I'm not tearing the family apart, Sharon. I'm protecting myself. For the first time in years, I'm doing what's right for me. Not for Eric. Not for you. For me. Eric shot a sharp look at Sharon, his face twisting with frustration. He was about to speak, but Marjorie cut him off, her voice suddenly firmer, more resolute. I know you both are upset, she said. But I've made my decision, and it's done. The trust is irrevocable, and the will is final. She reached for the papers on the coffee table and laid them out in front of them, one by one. The trust, the updated will, the deed to the house. She placed each document in front of them, her movements deliberate. The words were there, in black and white, too final for them to deny. Eric's eyes darted over the papers. His lips pressed into a tight line as he scanned the contents. He stopped, his gaze lingering on the final beneficiary section, and his expression shifted. For the first time in this entire ordeal, Marjorie saw him hesitate. What? What does this mean? Eric asked, his voice shaky. You're leaving everything to Anna? Marjorie nodded. Yes, Anna, she's the future. Not you. Not Sharon. Eric's eyes flickered with disbelief as he read through the legal language. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the paper. But this is my inheritance too. How could you? This isn't about inheritance, Marjorie interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. It's about control, and I'm done giving it up. I trusted you both for far too long, but when I realized I had nothing left, no voice, no space of my own, I made a choice. And this is it. Sharon stepped forward, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and something deeper. You're ruining us, Marjorie. This family. Her voice wavered slightly as she forced the words out, but it was clear the manipulative edge was still there, thinly veiled under the layers of hurt. Marjorie's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. What you don't understand, Sharon, she said quietly, is that I've been doing what's best for me. For Anna. I've done what was fair. The silence that followed was thick and charged with the weight of Marjorie's words. Sharon stood frozen, her lips trembling with the weight of something she couldn't quite say. But in her eyes, Marjorie could see the cracks of her own control beginning to break. It was no longer about her narrative. Eric's face darkened, and he stood suddenly, pushing the papers away, anger flashing in his eyes. You think you've won, don't you? Marjorie met his gaze with calm, unyielding resolve. Yes, Eric, I do. The tension in the room hung heavy for a moment longer before Eric spun on his heel and stormed out of the room, Sharon following close behind, her face flushed with disbelief. The door slammed behind them, leaving Marjorie alone in the silence. As the sound of their retreating footsteps faded, she let out a slow breath, her hand resting lightly on the stack of papers in front of her. She had made her choice. And it was done. The door had barely clicked shut before Marjorie let out the breath she had been holding. The tension in the room lingered like the echo of footsteps, the weight of Eric and Sharon's retreat still thick in the air. For a moment she stood there, her fingers curled around the edges of the papers that had secured her peace. The house felt quieter now, as if the space itself was exhaling, finally free from the control they'd once had over it. But the silence was short-lived. Eric's voice shattered it again, this time muffled through the door. Mom, wait. Please. Marjorie's stomach tightened, but she didn't hesitate. She moved to the door, opening it before he could raise his hand to knock. His eyes were wide, his chest rising and falling with the effort of restraining the anger still burning inside him. But something had shifted in him. There was a reluctance now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Eric began, his voice faltering as he stepped inside. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pushed so hard, but you have to understand. I thought this was for all of us. Marjorie crossed her arms, standing her ground. There was something almost pitiful in the way he struggled for control over his words, but she didn't let him off the hook. I understand exactly what you thought, she said, her voice steady but cutting through the apology like a sharp blade. You thought I'd just go along with whatever you decided. You thought I was still the same woman you could control. But I'm not. Eric opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His hands balled into fists at his sides, and for a moment he looked lost, like a child who didn't know how to navigate the world without a crutch. I've been intimidated for too long, Marjorie continued, her voice growing firmer. And I'm done. I'm not playing along with your games anymore, Eric. You don't get to treat me like I'm someone who can be managed. Eric's eyes flickered with something akin to shame, but his pride wasn't ready to die just yet. I never meant to. He started, but Marjorie cut him off with a simple gesture, a wave of her hand dismissing the excuse. No more explanations, she said, her words slow and deliberate. You took your chance. And you failed. A silence followed her declaration, thick and suffocating. Eric's face twisted with frustration as he tried to force the apology out, but it came out hollow, like the remnants of a once powerful voice, now reduced to a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't mean for things to go this way." Marjorie didn't move. She stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze locked on him. She could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the pride fighting against the recognition of failure. But there was no going back for him now. Not for her. Not for him. "I needed respect, not management," she said, her tone cutting through the air. "I needed you to see me, not just as a stepping stone, not just as someone who would hand things over without a second thought." His eyes flickered like a storm brewing inside, but he didn't speak again. Instead, there was a faint sigh that escaped him, something that sounded like resignation. Marjorie turned her gaze to the side, catching sight of Sharon still standing on the porch. Her arms were folded, her face set in an unreadable mask. Marjorie didn't need to say anything. Sharon's anger was palpable even from a distance, her body language sharp and defensive. Eric looked at his wife, then back at Marjorie, his expression torn between guilt and anger. Sharon's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her mouth opening to speak. "I can't believe you're doing this," she snapped. "You're destroying everything. This is not just your life, Marjorie. This is our family, our future, everything we've worked for. You're throwing it all away." The sharpness in Sharon's voice hit Marjorie like a dart, but she didn't flinch. She didn't feel the sting anymore. "I didn't destroy anything, Sharon. You and Eric did that when you decided to control everything, when you decided I didn't matter." Sharon's face flushed, her lips trembling with the weight of something deeply personal. But the anger, the arrogance, those were the only things left to cling to. "Fine," Sharon spat, her voice shaking with fury. "You want to play it like this? Go ahead. But you'll regret it. This family will never be the same." With that, she turned sharply, her heels clicking against the floor as she stormed out of the house. Eric stood there for a moment longer, his gaze darting between Marjorie and the door. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, with a deep sigh, he left, his shoulders slumping as he followed Sharon into the car parked at the curb. Marjorie stood there in the silence they left behind, the weight of her decision settling over her. For the first time in years, there was no storm, no lingering threat of guilt. There was only peace. She closed the door slowly, feeling the finality of it. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, the phone buzzed again. It was Stephen. Marjorie picked it up, glancing at the screen. He had the final trust documents. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. Her life was finally hers again, and no one could take it away. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, the final trust documents spread out before her. The weight of her decisions pressed down on her chest, but it was a different kind of weight now. No longer heavy with uncertainty, but firm, final, and resolute. The last page had been signed, and she had made it clear. Anna would be her sole beneficiary. She picked up the pen once more, her fingers steady as she marked the document, the words flowing under her hand like an inevitable course of fate. Her granddaughter would be the one to inherit it all. Her home, her legacy, her peace. She was the future. Not Eric, not Sharon, Anna. The decision felt right, deeper than any family ties or misguided expectations. Anna, with her quiet strength and unwavering support, was the only one who had truly seen her, who had never tried to control her. She had always been there, a silent partner in the battle for autonomy. Marjorie's fingers brushed the page with Anna's name, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She wasn't just protecting her assets. She was ensuring that the future would be different, free from the manipulation and control that had once suffocated her. And she would make sure Anna had everything she needed. With a sigh, she reached for the next document, the funds she had set aside for Anna's education, her art programs, her future. Marjorie had always seen the spark in her granddaughter. The world needed more of Anna's art, her creativity, her heart. It was time to nourish that spark, to invest in her future. Marjorie allocated the necessary funds, her pen moving deliberately across the page. It felt like a final gift, something that would outlast everything else. The future, and Anna's bright future at that, was secure. Hours later, Eric would receive the formal notice, and Marjorie knew it would hit him like a thunderclap. There would be no warning, no explanation. Just the stark, unyielding truth. He was fully disinherited. Marjorie had no regrets. The choice had been clear from the moment she had realized the full extent of his manipulation, the trust, the control, the belief that everything was his for the taking. He had never understood her. He never would. When the notice arrived, it was not in person. She couldn't bear the thought of facing him again. Not after everything. Instead, Stephen had handled it, sending it through the proper channels. The words would be final. Eric Hale is excluded from the estate. No second chances. No room for debate. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, her fingers rubbing the edge of the document. She'd known what needed to be done. She wasn't just protecting her assets. She was protecting herself. Later that evening, Anna stopped by, her usual quiet demeanor filling the room with a calming presence. Marjorie had expected her, had sensed the shift in the air the moment the papers had been finalized. Anna didn't speak as she entered, but her eyes, those eyes, full of understanding, met Marjorie's, and in that brief moment, the weight of everything settled. Anna sat beside her grandmother, her hand resting gently on Marjorie's. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Marjorie looked at her, her heart swelling with a love so deep, so fierce, that words could hardly describe it. Anna had been the one constant in her life, the one person who had never tried to take, never tried to control. She had simply been there. "You're welcome," Marjorie said softly, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected. "You've always been worth it." Anna's eyes welled up, and without another word she reached out and hugged Marjorie. It was a quiet, lingering embrace, one that spoke volumes of everything that had been unsaid between them, a bond stronger than blood, stronger than anything Eric and Sharon could ever break. "I'll make sure it's worth it," Anna whispered, her voice breaking just slightly. "I'll make sure I do something good with it all." Marjorie smiled, the warmth of her granddaughter's words settling her into a peace she hadn't known in years. She had made the right choice, not just for her future, but for Anna's. Later that night, as the house settled into the deep quiet of evening, Marjorie sat at the table, a letter in front of her. It was one final step, one last act of closure. She picked up the pen again and wrote it all down. Her reasons, her decisions, her explanation. There would be no more misunderstandings, no more manipulation. She owed them nothing, and this letter was the final mark of her independence. As she finished the last line, she set the pen down. There was no anger in her heart, no regret, only peace. Marjorie knew the family she had once belonged to was gone, but in its place was something stronger, something that couldn't be broken. And with a final, deep breath, she folded the letter, sealing it away. Her story was finally her own, and no one would ever take it from her again. It was done. The air in the study smelled of dust and old leather. Marjorie stood at the door, taking in the room her husband had once used as his domain. The wooden desk was the same, its surface scarred by years of use, the shelves lined with books she hadn't touched in years. But now, standing there, it felt different, like a place that was finally hers to reshape, not just a room she had let passively exist in the shadow of another life. She had already cleared out the old papers, the faded letters, the reminders of her former life with him. She could still hear his voice sometimes, the way he'd sit at the desk with his coffee, writing letters to clients, to friends, while the sound of the clock ticked on. But those memories, as bittersweet as they were, no longer held sway over her. Not anymore. Today, the room felt like a blank canvas, waiting to be painted with her own decisions, her own future. The study was a space of quiet reflection, but more than that, it was a space where she could finally breathe, finally live her own life. Marjorie ran her hand along the desk's surface, feeling the texture of the wood, the weight of time in her fingers. Then, without another thought, she rolled up her sleeves and, with her usual meticulous care, set to work. The first thing she did was clear out the shelves, replacing the dusty old books with her own collection. There were books on gardening, on self-improvement, and even a few novels she'd meant to read for years. The room filled with her personality, her hopes. And it felt like a place she could truly claim. The study transformed from a place of stagnation to a symbol of liberation. It wasn't just the study that had changed. Marjorie had found new purpose outside the confines of her home as well. Every Thursday afternoon, she volunteered at the senior center, helping people with document literacy. She had spent her life organizing papers, handling correspondence, managing finances, but now her skills were a gift to others. She taught people how to fill out forms, how to read official documents, how to ensure they understood the language that had once left her feeling helpless. At first, she had been nervous, unsure of how she would be received. But the elderly women and men welcomed her with open arms, eager to learn from someone who had lived through their struggles. Marjorie had always been good at listening, and now she listened to them as they shared their stories. Each day spent teaching gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. It was as though she had found a second calling, one that had been waiting patiently for her to arrive. Anna, too, was thriving. Marjorie had given her the space to grow, to find her own path, and as always, Anna had not disappointed. One afternoon, she came over, her arms full of sketchbooks and papers. She set them down on the table with a wide smile, her eyes glinting with excitement. "Grandma," she said, her voice brimming with pride, "I wanted to show you my new sketches. They're inspired by everything you've done, all the changes, your strength." Marjorie smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet pride as Anna spread the sketches out before her. The colors were bold, vibrant, just like Anna's spirit. Each sketch was a visual representation of the strength and resilience Marjorie had instilled in her. They weren't just drawings, they were reflections of the journey they had both taken together. "This is beautiful, Anna," Marjorie said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've captured everything. It's perfect." Anna smiled shyly, her eyes meeting Marjorie's with gratitude. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did, Grandma. You didn't let anything stop you. You stood your ground." Marjorie reached across the table, taking Anna's hand in hers. "You're going to make a difference, Anna. You're going to create something that lasts." The changes in Marjorie's life weren't just about her home or the documents she had signed. They were about her spirit, her sense of self. Lucy and Stephen came by a week later with updated copies of Marjorie's portfolio, all the legal documents finalized. They sat with her at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, discussing the future. Stephen's quiet approval was written on his face, but it was Lucy's smile that made Marjorie feel truly seen. "Look at you," Lucy said, her voice filled with warmth. "You've turned this house into a place that belongs to you in every sense, and now you're helping others. You're living your life on your own terms. You've found your peace." Marjorie leaned back in her chair, looking at the three people who had become her closest confidants: Anna, Lucy, and Stephen. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. She felt stronger than she ever had before. She had built a life that was entirely hers, and that night, the three of them toasted to independence, to honesty, and to peace. It was a quiet celebration, but it was more than just a drink. It was a marking of the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Marjorie raised her glass, her heart full of gratitude. "To new beginnings," she said softly. "To new beginnings," they echoed. The house, once filled with shadows, now hummed with light, its walls holding the stories of a woman who had reclaimed everything that had once been taken from her. The life she had finally owned, on her own terms, was everything she had dreamed of. And it was just the beginning. The letter arrived early one morning, its envelope a stark contrast to the quiet of the house. Marjorie held it in her hands for a long moment before tearing it open. She already knew what it was. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eric's. The words, however, were not what she had expected. The letter was short, but it carried the weight of everything he had never said before. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the words on the page. The apology was there. Clumsy, self-serving, but it was an apology all the same. The tone was resigned, like someone who had finally realized that the battle was lost. He had written it with a mixture of frustration and a faint, hollow regret. In it, he acknowledged the hurt he had caused, the mistakes he had made, but it felt more like an attempt to placate his own guilt than to genuinely understand the depth of the damage he'd inflicted. She read it once, twice, a third time, her gaze unwavering, each line deeper in meaning than the last. Eric hadn't grasped the full picture. He hadn't seen that his apology was just another attempt to rewrite their history, to bend the narrative in his favor. It was incomplete, a fraction of what was needed. The final sentence lingered in her mind longer than the others. "I'll always be your son, Mom. You'll regret this." Marjorie let out a slow breath. She knew what had to be done. The apology, empty as it was, didn't change anything. She placed the letter gently back in the envelope, the weight of its unfulfilled promises heavy in her hands. Then, she slid it into a folder labeled Past. She had been carrying him, his anger, his demands, for far too long. Now, the folder would hold his apology, just as it had once held his expectations. Both were part of her past, but neither would hold power over her again. Later that afternoon, Anna arrived, as she often did these days, her arms full of new sketches and ideas. Marjorie smiled as she saw her granddaughter's eyes light up with enthusiasm. Anna was the future. Anna was her strength, her reason to continue pushing forward, to keep building a life that was truly hers. They moved to the study, where Anna had been helping her reorganize the shelves. The transformation of the space had been a long time coming, but now it felt like the heart of the home. Anna had added her own touches: bright books, colorful vases, pieces of her artwork that brought warmth to the walls. It was no longer just Marjorie's space. It was a shared one. A space that belonged to both of them. A place where the past could be honored without the weight of its chains. As they rearranged the shelves, Marjorie felt the deep sense of peace settle in. The past was no longer something to fear. It was something she had learned to let go of, piece by piece. She smiled at Anna, knowing she had made the right choice, knowing that Anna would carry the light forward. The afternoon faded into evening, and Marjorie stepped into the backyard that was hers, completely and entirely. The house, the land, the freedom, it all felt so solid, so real. For so long it had been a place of shadows, of old debts and even older wounds, but now it was a place of new beginnings. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, and the sky was painted in the soft hues of a sunset that Marjorie had never fully appreciated before. She inhaled deeply, the scent of the outdoors filling her lungs. The weight in her chest, the tension that had lived there for so long, loosened, like something finally being released. She felt lighter than she had in years, like the weight of a lifetime had been lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't just the estate she had taken back. It was her dignity, her identity. She was free. Completely. Wholly free. As the night settled in, Marjorie returned to her chair at the kitchen table where her journal lay waiting. The pages were filled with her thoughts, her reflections, the story of her life. She picked up the pen, feeling the weight of it in her hand, like an extension of her own strength. She had written for years, but now the words felt different, deeper. Her hand moved slowly, thoughtfully, as she wrote the words that had been waiting to be spoken. My decisions, my dignity. She paused, the pen hovering over the page. For the first time in so long, there was no hesitation, no doubt. The decisions she had made were hers. The dignity she had fought for was hers. The life she had reclaimed, every single piece of it, was hers to live. She was the one who had written this story, and no one else could ever change that. As she closed the journal, a soft smile tugged at her lips. The last line of her journey was already written. The past, the regrets, the manipulations, they were gone. Marjorie had taken back everything. He had said, "Don't touch anything here," and so she had touched the paper with his name removed. And in doing so, she had reclaimed her life.